Good evening, everyone. My name is Kendra, and welcome to the second part of the World Through the Lens of Race series. My position is I'm the director of the Dr. Ralph J. Bunch Committee. The Alumni Scholars Club, in collaboration with the UCLA Alumni Association, is very proud to have organized this event in hopes of creating a more equitable and just future for all of our communities. This event will highlight some amazing personal narratives from our panelists, in addition to answering some questions we all share. Before this, I want to acknowledge the Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, where UCLA currently stands. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce my presidential associate, Tony, who will go over some of the Zoom guidelines.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Tony. I'm the presidential associate for the Alumni Scholars Club. Throughout this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to send it out in the chat. You can also send it privately to the panelists. And just throughout, again, this process, please be cognizant of the language used and understanding of the situation.
And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight's session, Gabrielle Regalado. Gabrielle is a PhD candidate in African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley with a designated emphasis in critical theory. His research focuses on the Black radical tradition, Marxist theory, and Third World Revolution. He is also a Los Angeles-based community organizer with the Social Justice Learning Institute. Please give a warm welcome to Gabrielle, and as well as the other panelists.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. All right. So yeah, my name is Gabriel. Again, I'm from UC Berkeley. I will be your moderator this evening. And tonight we'll be talking about operationalizing anti-racism. Operationalizing. Now, what does that mean? I think many of us are familiar with what sentimental or symbolic gestures of anti-racism, looks like. This can be diversity and inclusion sort of sentiments, or putting a Black or brown face on a college recruitment poster, right, or a military recruitment poster. But tonight we're going to be talking about how to operationalize that, rather than just offer anti-racist discourse in a sentimental or symbolic way. So let me go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists. So we have the wonderful Deanna Smith, who is an educational justice advocate and school administrator. Deanna was born and raised in Spokane, Washington, before going to receive her master's in education from Notre Dame University and moving to California. And so she moved to Oakland, and while she was living in the Bay Area, she taught 5th grade and middle school math and science. And her firsthand experience of the dysfunction and institutional racism in schools led her to found EDGE, the Educational Justice Working Group, right, which provides coaching for teachers and helps schools build their capacity to implement abolitionist practices. So as a student, teacher, and activist, Deanna has fought to dismantle white supremacy in education and center the liberation of Black, Indigenous, people of color students, right? She's also a doctoral student at LMU in the program of education of justice. Our next panelist is Jelani Hendricks. Jelani was born in Fresno, California. He moved to LA to pursue his bachelor's degree as an undergraduate in Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA. And it was there that he began his student activism and organizing. Jelani is a community advocate who strives to bridge the gap between grassroots community advocacy, progressive policy, and electoral politics. He works as a youth organizer, he worked as a youth organizer at Community Coalition. That's when he started. And he also worked in their civic engagement component. At the Social Justice Learning Institute, Jelani was the director of the Policy and Advocacy Program. And that's where he played a pivotal role in adopting a rent control ordinance in the city of Inglewood. That was a major, major victory. He currently works at SEIU 2015 as the special assistant to the president of the union. He currently serves as a board member of the Inglewood South Bay Democratic Club, and he is the president of the Black Los Angeles Young Democrats, GLADE. So give it up for Mr. Jelani Hendricks. And our young organizer and panelist is Emanuel Caronli, who is a student organizer with the Social Justice Learning Institute, as well as the Brother Son Selves Coalition. He's an 11th grader attending University Pathways Medical Magnet Academy, or UMed for short. Manuel was born and raised in Carson, California to Nigerian parents. He's a passionate reader with a knack for taking on leadership roles. So give it up for our wonderful panelists. Each of them have a very deep engagement in anti-racist activism and organizing. And so without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and actually dive into our discussion questions. All right, so when we're thinking about how each of you are positioned in your endeavor to push for liberatory policies, liberatory practices in your fields of work and education, right? I want to think about the material and emotional sort of devastation that anti-Blackness has wrought specifically, as well as xenophobia and state-sanctioned violence. And so everyone on this panel knows firsthand that racism in those expressions are not accidental, right? They're not accidental or anomalous, it's not random. What are the life experiences that you've undergone that that made you realize that racism isn't an accident, that it's intentional, it's on purpose? And so whoever wants to take it on first.
I can start. First and foremost, just want to say thank you for having me. I love the Bunch Center and all you do for our community. So it's an honor to be here. I think the first time I realized racism was systemic was in elementary school. I remember going to back to school night with my mother in the first grade. And I had one of those moms that was very engaged and active in my education. And one of the things that she noticed when I came home to do my homework, the subjects were they weren't as advanced as they needed to be. Asking me about like what color, my colors, my numbers, things of that nature. And my mom felt it was time for me to learn how to read. And at back to school night, when my mom asked the teacher, when are we going to teach the students how to read? She said that we weren't ready. And my mom ended up taking me out of my school that was in a historical Black neighborhood and taking me to another elementary school on the other side of town. And I was the only Black student in the class, but everyone knew how to read. Everyone knew their subtraction, their addition. I didn't know any of that stuff. And I remember going on vacation. We were on the track system, so I remember going on winter break for like a month, and my grandfather took the time to teach me how to read, to do my math problems. And first grade, I caught up to everyone, but by the time I was in the second grade, I had an 8th grade reading level. But in the first grade, I went to a school who wouldn't even take the time to teach me how to read. And that's when I realized that it was a difference between education, depending on what area you lived in, depending on the color of your skin, depending on what type of school you went to. And I thank God for my mother, because she pulled me out of that school and may have saved my life. We all know that your education attainment, it has a lot to do with your place in society, your status in society. And a lot of folks who don't receive a proper, adequate education, particularly Black people, Black boys, end up on the school to prison pipeline. So that's when I really noticed the difference. Once I got into middle school, I was put in a gang database because some friends of mine, we had a crew. We weren't a real street gang, but a kid got beat up.
We may be experiencing some technical difficulties with Jelani's camera and audio. But if you can hear me, Jelani, thank you for that. We'll get back to you whenever it is that you're able to come back. I definitely been through some similar experiences when I first came to America. I'm a Filipino immigrant, and when I got to the 3rd grade, they immediately put me in like one of those speech pathology classes. Even though I spoke perfect English, they just kind of assumed that I couldn't speak, I couldn't talk right. Go ahead, Ms. Smith. You can go next.
I had a very similar experience to Jelani. My neighborhood school was a failing school. I'm from Spokane, Washington, so pretty far away from California, but similar issues. I then transferred to a Montessori school. So it was a very well-respected, well-regarded school in the community, but because of the location and because of the hoops that you kind of have to jump through to get into a gifted or track school like that, I was the only student of color, not the only Black person, the only person of color, period, in a school of about 600. So my experience was very different from that of my neighbors. When I was at school, I was surrounded by, just bougie people who had access to all of these crazy things. And then my friends in the neighborhood, I very quickly realized that we were having 2 very different experiences at school. What I'll add to something that's pretty similar to Jelani's experience is that when I became a teacher, I saw more of the backstage side of that and what that looks like, from working in systemically under-resourced and purposefully under-resourced schools in Oakland, California, to working in very, very high and well-resourced schools in San Francisco, seeing the way that all of that is very intentional by design, seeing the way that our system disadvantages schools and teachers and students intentionally to create that hierarchy, gave me more insight to just how pervasive it was. My experience as a student, from the age of 6, being in the 1st grade, I knew that there was something going on and it wasn't right that I was the only kid from my neighborhood in that school. But then as a teacher, I saw more of like how the sausage was made, as they say, and the policies and the practices and the political moves that really work to sustain a system like that. So that was my experience as a teacher, gave me more insight to how deep the problem really was.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. So we definitely see exceptionalism, right, at play, tokenism, and a way to really elevate the what am I trying to say? The optics of diversity and inclusion in certain programs, with that, but with little regard to how you and Jelani were actually sort of feeling, and your socio-emotional wellness, right? Emanuel, you wanna go next?
Yeah. Listening to the testimony, I was thinking about, I had like a similar experience like in the 8th grade. But like the instance that really made me notice that like racism was systemic was the death of Trayvon Martin. It was at a time like when I was like really young. I was 8 when he died. And I remember I was hearing all the news about it. It was like an 8-year-old seeing how this grown man had came and killed a kid just for buying something at the store and walking down. And he didn't go to jail. He was let off, just like let free. And it was just crazy to me how, like, growing up, it's like, oh, you taught that everybody knows what's right and what's wrong, like adults, they know the right thing. But then you hear that this grown adult, when he did this to some random kid, especially because, like, I'm dark skinned and, like, there, like, always these stereotypes that, oh, dark skinned people, like, I've always been told, like, oh, dark skinned people are rougher and just, like, more, just, like, angry and stuff. And like the truth is, I'm just like a cool dude. And it's like when I'm 8, like I was walking to the store. I remember, I will never forget this. I went to the store and I had a hood on. It was cold. I put my hood on. I just remember I had to take it off. I didn't know what that happened to me. It was just crazy. Because like even now, my parents still remember it. They always tell me, oh, you have to watch how you walk. You have to watch how you talk to the police. You have to watch like every like little thing, and then like it kind of lets me have an anxiety in public, because I'm this big black dude, and I don't want anyone to like feel like, oh, they're threatened by me or anything like that. But I'm not doing anything. It's just because someone chose to say that this black kid was a threat. And like it's always crazy to me when I hear like arguments about it. Because like the way I see it is if George Zimmerman could like be still threatened by a black kid who's just buying Skittles in Arizona, how does that black kid feel about this grown white man with a gun chasing him? Like if he can be threatened by this kid with Skittles, how can like it's just crazy to me, and it's just amazing how some people just don't like see how biased and messed up it is. And it's just like it's just kind of scary because like I have younger siblings, I have younger cousins. It's like I never want them to go through something like that. I never want them to become the next thing. And it feels like as I get older, all those like stories on the news, like they get closer and closer, and it's just like scary. So I feel like that's when I really realized everything that was going on.
Definitely, Emanuel. Hypervisibility is something that racialized folks definitely are acute of when they're in predominantly white spaces, right? And just you can feel it in your skin, right? Just how visible you are. And Jelani, I'm gonna let you finish the thought. Welcome back. I'm gonna let you finish what you were talking about. But first, I want to respond to a question by Bailey Kaler. Hope I'm saying that right, or pronouncing your name correctly. She's asking to elaborate on exceptionalism, or the term exceptionalism. In this context, what we mean is the notion that those who are deserving of the highest quality of services or education are those who need to be the most outstandingly, academically gifted, right? When it comes to people of color and Black people in particular, right? Go ahead, Jelani. I know you got cut off.
Yes. So I went to a school that didn't teach me how to read. And by the time I got to the end of the second grade, I had an 8th grade reading level. And then I was put in the magnet courses, and it was totally different. The quality of education that you have in a magnet course versus just a regular course is crazy. Once I got to middle school, I was put in a gang database. There were a few of my friends, we had a crew on campus, but the administration decided to criminalize us because one of the students got in a fight. It was kind of violent, but all of us didn't fight. All of us weren't even there, but we were all put in a gang database in the 8th grade. And at the time, I didn't realize how significant that was. But if I went to school on the north side of Fresno, would this be the case? I would say no. I would think that some type of restorative justice approaches would be implemented to solve the problem versus putting kids in a gang database. But education was the first system to really show me that racism was systemic.
Sure, thank you for sharing that, Jelani, and thank you all for sharing your experiences. I know that sometimes it can be tough to talk about, to kind of go back and think about what you went through. I know it can be sort of triggering of traumas that you've experienced. So I definitely want to, just appreciate you all for being vulnerable, right? Now, given those experiences, right, at what point in your lives would you say that you realized you wanted to get involved in social justice work, right? Obviously you've lived through racist experiences. At what point did you feel like, okay, I got to do something about this, right? And how did you tap in? How did you become an advocate or an organizer?
How did I know that I wanted to get into this work, and how did I tap in? I think I've always been an advocate for social justice, even before I was really able to do anything, even as a kid. When I was a teenager, I had a lot of opinions about how things were done. I was constantly asking questions and pushing back at the administration at my high school. Just always advocating for things, and kind of got the reputation of being the student with the pushback all of the time. I didn't really conceptualize it as social justice. That word wasn't, or a term wasn't in my vernacular until I went to college, because I went to Gonzaga University for my undergrad, which is a Jesuit school. So the Jesuits are really big on social justice as a concept. I don't think that they actualize social justice very well, but they're big on the idea. So I learned that term. And I was, and we were pretty enculturated into the idea that social justice is something that we should really be passionate about and aspire to fight for. What's interesting about most universities, though, is that they really encourage you to think critically, but not about the systems of the university itself. So we're advocating for social justice, but it was really like social justice outside of this space. Like, think about social justice, but not necessarily what that looks like here. So as an undergraduate student, I wrote for the school newspaper about the school harboring some priests that were involved in a sexual assault problem. I wrote about, the school breaking its commitment to the local indigenous population, the Spokane tribe. And so my main outlet was just the school newspaper. I would just anonymously write these kind of like expose kind of pieces all the time. And, eventually it caught up with me. I got caught. So I had to change my methods, but it was really pushing the school to see that there were issues at the campus. They wanted us to talk about social justice, but it was very much focused on even internationally. But then when I was in school, Black Lives Matter was also really starting to gain traction. And we actually were banned from certain things. We were banned from having a die-in. We were banned from having all kinds of things that are under our free right to assemble, and our right to speech. But we were banned from a lot of those issues. So I think I started to question what the scope of social justice can really be in an institution. And so what I started tapping into was ways to push back at the system that I was in at that exact moment. And I carried that work into the classroom with me when I became a teacher. I was, also the teacher that had a problem with the curriculum, had a problem with the way that we were doing everything. So I've tried to make sure that my work is critical, I guess, taking a critical lens and not being afraid to be that person in different spaces, and really trying to lead the work, even though it doesn't seem like there is an avenue. Because I think a lot of times the avenues that are presented to us to advocate for social justice are like pretty safe. If somebody's giving you a clear map and like a clear cut way of this is an acceptable way to protest or push back, I don't know if it's as radical as it needs to be. So I think that if I offered any advice to anybody thinking to get into it, is don't take the lowest hanging fruit of the, I guess, accepted way of fighting for social justice in that context.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. And so you've been on the ball out the womb, which is, not my story with social justice. So kudos to you and your parents or whoever, your village, for really fostering those values and fostering an environment in which you felt like you could be an activist, right? And so, and you also touched on the complexities of institutions, how the Jesuit sort of environment is what fostered this notion of social justice, or how you were introduced to it, but how it's also guilty of many institutional forms of oppression, right? Go ahead, Emanuel, Mr. Caronli. You want to tackle the question? How did you get involved?
For me, I didn't just have the ball rolling. For me, it was just over time, I started to learn about a lot of the underlying issues that were present. So I remember when what's it called, Straight Outta Compton came out, and I remember the trailer, and it was F the police and stuff like that. And I remember I started learning about themes. I was just looking up on it, and I was why was all these things happening back then, the song, or the police doing this, that, and the third. I was just looking at it, and I just saw how like the history about it. And then I saw like my own school, like I started noticing things in my own school, like in my own school, like in my middle school. I went to school in Carson, and I noticed that like we had like a nurse like once a week, like only on the Tuesday we had a nurse. Like every single day of the week, there was like 2, 3 officers like walking around the campus. And I don't know what got into my head. It was just like one day where like I just saw the officer he was driving, and I know I initiated the exchange. I was like, that's the police, and then he stopped, and like I got scared. I know I got scared because he was like, I ran inside. I was like, oh, he's gonna do something to me. I don't want nothing to happen to me. And then luckily he drove off. Like I don't know how many minutes later after he came back, and I was standing with my friends. I'm like, oh, I see this like right man with glasses. He stared us down, and I was just scared. It was like I don't want to become another kid on the news. And then I will never forget that moment. And I got to high school. And then when I got to high school, I started to have a social justice learning class at the Social Justice Learning Institute. And I learned like even more. I even learned that all of these like instances of like these racist practices were even acknowledged by the government. They're on the FBI like website, and like it was there. Like it wasn't like it was fabricated, it was fake. It was actual things that they did and did in place. And then a year into my second semester into ninth grade, I was given the opportunity to work with the Brother Son Self Coalition. And so with the Brother Son Self Coalition, I was able to like actually go and like learn how to do lobbying and talk to lawmakers and like change like go and advocate for change. So it was like over time I learned like about all these things, and it kind of like it was stored away, like built up. Then I got to ninth grade and I got to high school, and I was given the avenue to express myself and like try and advocate for the change I want to see, and all those things I have seen throughout my life.
So for you, it was more so, well, you identified the issue of over policing in your community and your schools, and you and then you just couldn't help yourself after watching Straight Outta Compton, which I totally understand. But then you also touched on the importance of like opportunities and avenues to get involved, which the Social Justice Learning Institute, as well as the Brother Son Self Coalition, provided for you. So thank you for that elaboration. There is a question about so Alex Wahlberg is asking, what are some signs that an organization like a university is only advocating for justice in name but not in practice? I'm actually hold on that, because I think that rolls over very smoothly into the next part of our discussion. So just keep that in mind, y'all, when you're answering the next question. But go ahead, Mr. Hendricks, tell us your story of your rise in the activist game.
Great. Okay. So for me, my journey started in high school in BSU, Black Student Union. And it was significant for me because I actually got to learn about my history, learn about my, have like a self-awareness of what it meant to be a Black man in America. And a lot of times in the educational system, you learn about slavery, and that's it. You don't learn about anything else. But in BSU, we learned about pre-colonial Africa, right? And the contributions that our people made, not only to this country, but to the world. And I figured out that I had a really good knack at recruiting people. So we would have meetings, and we'll have 200, 300 people in our BSU meetings. We'll have to have them in a gym. And I was organizing my peers to join BSU, and I didn't even know what an organizer was. I was just passionate about BSU, and I wanted my people, my peers, my friends to get the knowledge that I was receiving. Once I got to college and moved to LA, I went to Cal State Los Angeles. The first class I took was on race, class, and gender in American society. And that's when I started to really develop a critical consciousness of my positionality in America, but not just, the Black perspective, but I learned about sexism, right? I learned about intersectionality. I learned about xenophobia, homophobia. These are things that were foreign to me, and it allowed me to see social justice from a macro point of view, I would say. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go on a civil rights tour in Alabama that the university paid for. And it was one of the most pivotal moments of my life. It actually changed me. So some of you are probably familiar with the story of the 4 girls who were murdered in a church. It was a bombing. I believe it's called the 16th Street Baptist Church, if I'm not mistaken. I actually went to that church. I went to a lot of different historical sites throughout Selma, throughout Birmingham, throughout Montgomery, and it really inspired me to be a change agent. And at that time, I was undecided for my major, but I was really intrigued in Pan-African studies. And a professor on that trip told me, hey, you should major in Pan-African studies if you like it. And I told them, well, what kind of job am I going to get with a Pan-African studies degree? And she said to me, well, if you do what you're passionate about, you work hard, the career, the money, it'll come. And she was right. But to back up just a little bit more, once I got back to LA, I became a Pan-African studies major. I was calling a department, no one was answering the phone, and I actually ran into the chair of the department, Melina Abdullah, and told her, hey, I want to major in Pan-African studies. This is what I want to do. Will you help me? Will you guide me? Tell me which classes to take? And she did. And what I really appreciate about the Pan-African Studies department at Cal State LA is we just don't theorize and talk about racism and social justice and all these different things. We're challenged to go out and put in and practice, right? Practice what we're learning and actually go out and be change agents and organizers and activists. And that's exactly what me and my peers did at that time. We had a lot of different campaigns. When I was in school, tuition and fees were increasing at a crazy rate. I think when I started, it was $1,200 a quarter, and when I left, it was $25. And we actually got a tuition and fee moratorium implemented for Cal State LA. We also led a campaign to get ethnic studies as a general education requirement. So we did a lot of powerful things on campus, and I really flexed my organizing muscles and developed my advocacy skills. And from there, every job I've had since I've graduated from college has been rooted in social justice, has been rooted in advocacy, whether it's housing or housing advocacy, labor activism, Black Lives Matter. I can say that I'm well-rounded when it comes to organizing, but it all started at Edison High School with Mr. Finley and the Black Student Union.
For sure. So for you, affinity spaces and definitely ethnic studies, Black studies departments played a very critical role then in your sort of, in being thrust into student activism. That's great. And so now that we all know a little bit more about the origins of your organizing and activist work, and I see you, Tom Tran, where we're definitely going to dive into that, into the dynamics of intercommunal tension as well as violence, right? Which is a very important conversation when we're talking about meaningful solidarity work across different communities. So I'm just saying, I see you. But to sort of go back to Alex's question about, well, how do we, what are the signs, right? I want to touch on the Black Lives Matter movement. And so last summer, we saw a dramatic shift in public opinion, the mainstream public opinion of Black Lives Matter as a slogan and as a movement, right? We saw, different corporations and both, mainstream political parties, declaring Black Lives Matter, right? And featuring it on their promotional and campaign material, right? And we saw Black Lives Matter painted on the streets. We saw, elected officials with the Black Power salute. We saw George W. Bush say Black Lives Matter. We saw Mitt Romney at a Black Lives Matter rally. What do these sort of symbolic gestures of solidarity, what did that mean to y'all, right? What was the significance of those gestures to y'all? Yeah, go ahead. What did they mean?
I could start on this one. Forgive me if I sound a little pessimistic. I think symbolism is important, but symbolism doesn't change the material conditions and outcomes for marginalized communities. It doesn't change our reality. It feels good, it looks good, but is it really doing us any good? I'll give you an example. When Barack Obama was elected, a lot of people used him as a symbol to say, hey, we live in a post-racialized society, right? But those of us who know better know that's not true. So symbolism can be inspiring, it can be uplifting, but it can also be used as a tool to erase our struggle. I can give another example of symbolism. In the summer, like you mentioned, Netflix had a multitude of Black shows, right? They had Moesha came out of nowhere, Girlfriends, all these Black shows that I personally grew up watching as a child were now on Netflix. And I was, oh yeah, this is great. Like I get to watch all the stuff I used to watch as a kid, as an adult. But it doesn't mean anything. Like Netflix, other corporations have the resources and the power to change the lives of marginalized people in this country, and they decide not to. They you know, they'll paint the sidewalk and it'll say Black Lives Matter, but what action are you really putting behind your words? So for me, if the work I'm doing is not impacting if it's not transforming the material conditions of Black people or marginalized people, for me, it's a waste of time. And I'm not saying that symbolism isn't important. It is, but it should come from us. And you need to be aware on how the establishment will use these symbols as tools to continue to promote white supremacy and capitalism and sexism. The list goes on. You know, I work in the nonprofits. Well, I used to work in the 501c3 nonprofit sector. One of my critiques was, it's great that we're getting this money to get kids into college. It's great that we're getting money to provide all these services and programs, but if philanthropy really wanted to change and transform society, they would give us the resources to build our own infrastructure. And they don't do that because it would destroy the current establishment. It would disrupt everything. So I'm just challenging you all, you know, just to use that third eye, be critical, and be aware of how the establishment manipulates the masses, even within the social justice movement.
Woo! That man said it don't mean diddly squat unless it's about creating political and economic power for Black communities. I know. Show you right. Y'all remember that term from the 90s? Nah? Okay. Go ahead, Ms. Smith.
Yeah, I mean, respectfully, symbolism really doesn't mean anything unless it's accompanied with changes and actions and accountability. I think that that's the power that a lot of schools have, especially because I think someone asked about universities and performative allyship or performative activism. That's what a lot of schools do, right? Lip service, mission statements, apologies, acknowledging, etc. It doesn't change anything about power structures. So I'll give you a good example of an organization that I think was not performative, right? So I don't know if all y'all know about Glossier. It's a makeup brand. So Glossier is a makeup brand, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on during Black Lives Matter. Lots of people are posting Black squares or that Black Lives Matter, or they're like, you know, highlighting Black owned brands, etc. What Glossier decided to do is to go past that and earmark a specific percentage of their funds that are going to be direct, like no interest loans to Black and brown business owners who want to start their own businesses in the beauty industry. That is very different than saying Black Lives Matter on your Instagram, because then you're really hoping to change the material circumstances for Black and brown people. So they've already done a couple loans to some Indigenous owned brands, they've done some Black owned brands, right? And it's no interest. And most importantly, there's no accountability, right? There's no like, we want to say what you can do with this money, because that's what happens a lot with charity, right? People want to put parameters on how you can spend the money. So they're just giving it to them, right? That's really using your positional power or your white privilege, because you don't run out of white privilege. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So you can keep using it and giving it out, and your, you know, bank account of white privilege will refill automatically, but you can spend it on Black and brown people. And I work with a lot of folks who are frustrated by the performative activism, right? My school put up a Black Lives Matter sign, but they're not doing anything. And so I say, okay, well, let's hold them accountable to that, right? Like, look at your school mission statements, and those type of statements are great for me, because then you can build an argument off of that. If someone says Black Lives Matter, then you can put yourself in a position to where you're with the decision maker saying, how are you going to demonstrate that Black Lives Matter? So for me, when I work with folks or schools that want to translate this performativity into some action, I always talk about facts, numbers, deadlines. What's your 30, 60, 90-day plan to bring about social justice? Like, how many Black faculty do you want? How much money are you going to spend to ensure that Black and brown students have access to whatever it is that you say that you're offering? Those kinds of measures you can call on organizations to implement those measures after they've done something symbolic. So don't get discouraged if you see like an organization or person just being symbolic. Just know, like, take a note. Okay, you say Black Lives Matter, I'm gonna hold you to that. And then you need to hold their feet to the fire. And that's where the advocacy comes in. But I think that a lot of organizations, when they posted listening and learning or the Black Square, they were banking on what's happening right now. They were banking on us like moving on, like low key forgetting about what they said. So they were banking that, okay, we'll just say that we're listening and learning, we'll do whatever, but then no one's gonna come around in 6 months and say, hey, you did a lot of listening and learning. Like, who did you listen to? What have you learned? What are your next steps, right? So I think maintaining that fire is how we can collectively push back against performative allyship and activism and force people to take it to the next level, which is actually some changes in the material circumstances and power structures.
For sure, for sure. Expropriation of resources, right? Expropriation that a meaningful and substantive, transfer of meaningful resources. What about you, Mr. Caronli? What does symbolism mean to you?
Yeah, I agree with what they both say. Like, especially like when Jelani was talking about how on Netflix they had like a little Black Lives Matter section. I was just thinking about it because I remember they also brought like the Dave Chappelle show. But then the problem with that was when they brought the Dave Chappelle show on Netflix, they weren't paying him. He's like, stop watching it, take it all. Like they were talking about, oh, Black Lives Matter, but they couldn't even pay the man for his show. And it showed how like they had this image that they wanted to support, but they didn't even really support it. And it was just making me think about like how everybody was talking about Black Lives Matter, and like during the summer it was like this big thing. Everybody was talking about it, but then after a while it kind of died down and people weren't doing nothing. Things were still going on, and it didn't seem like it changed that much. A lot of people were talking about, oh, we support it, and it didn't really change nothing. I remember when I heard about like in the LA, I think it was the LAPD, they were spreading around this image of George Floyd, and it was like for Valentine's Day, it was like a joke saying, "You take my breath away." And it's just crazy because this is man's life that they're just joking about. And we were just talking about how we don't want to see this happening again, and they're just taking it lightly and not really caring. It just shows how even with everything that went on, every single bit of people outside moving, even the people who were actually doing real activism, like the people who were doing performative activism, because like they didn't like really push or do anything. I feel like there was a lot more like performative than like real. Because I know there was a lot of people outside, but like for like the companies and stuff, they were just like spreading out a message to make sure people bought their products. Because there's like so many people who were just like blasting the message and not doing so much, it didn't like do as much change as it seemed. So that's just like my real thing. It was like they made it seem like so much was gonna change, but then there was nothing really behind it. There was really no force behind it.
For sure. So what I'm hearing from all of you, right, is sort of the distinction between the goals of a liberal integrationist strategy versus a more revolutionary, if you will, right, versus a more incisive unearthing of the structural problems that plague, communities of color. And so with that, one particular term has been gaining a lot of steam around activist and organizing circles, right? And it's the language of abolition, right? Abolition. It's a term that Angela Davis had resurrected, right, in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, the original iteration is referring to the movement to abolish legal physical slavery in the 19th century. But Angela Davis resurrected it as a way to say, look, the expressions and mechanics of racism today are just as bad, right? And just as urgently in need of being abolished. So would you all say that there's a difference between anti-racism and abolition work? And if so, what makes abolition work different from anti-racism?
You can go first if you want to.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, all right. I was just going to talk about like I really learned about abolition over the summer. In my organization, we really learned about the word. It was the first time I had like heard of the word like outside of like the slave history like discussion. And I think the difference between anti-racism work and abolition is for anti-racism work, you're still gonna just like you're taking the same stuff and you're just like kind of like just moving it around. But with abolition, they're like taking everything away and they want to start new. And I think with abolition is better because if you just like just tweak just stuff just a little bit, it's not really going to change anything. It's still going to be the same thing at its core. It's just like it's like doing a makeup job. It's like cleaning a room, but instead of like really cleaning like all the dirty places, you just clean it to make it seem like it's clean, but there's still like dirt under the rug and this, that, and the third. And so with abolition, it's just like just like a whole like redo, it's a reset, and it's like a whole like new. I feel like with abolition, you can do like a new pathway. It's like clearing away the old stuff to make way for the new. Like I remember, like I've seen it in like shows and stuff. Like they're always talking about there cannot be like creation without destruction first. Not to like be grim or anything, but I feel like things have to be like thrown away and old stuff have to be, especially because a lot of people don't complain about like when it comes to like liberal, like not revolutionary, but like liberal like ideas and stuff. They're always talking about, oh, like when it comes to racism, they're always like, oh, why are you talking about the same old stuff? But then the way I think of it is, why is it that we still have these same old like laws and stuff that have not been touched or changed in years? But then you're telling me like I'm talking about old like topics. And it's just crazy. So I feel like abolition is something that we need because we can't just keep using the same like old stuff that was not made for us.
For sure. You, Mr. Caronli saying, just throw it all away. Throw it all away. It's all trash. Ms. Smith, you want to go next?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll speak about education, my field specifically for anti-racism versus abolition. And I think that anti-racist is occupying a similar space as diversity, equity, and inclusion has been occupying. And if you have been, in education or maybe even in higher ed, right, a lot of things will get under that umbrella of inclusion, equity, DEI. And if you really look at those terms, like what they mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that doesn't necessarily include acknowledging that the entire system itself has some like structural problems that isn't working. So in the education system, for example, like 30 to 40% of all US students do not reach the goals that we set out for them. 30 to 40% like are not at grade level, are not going to college, are not what we would call like A plus, B plus successful students, products of the education system. So if your system isn't working for almost 50% of the people that you are pushing through it, I think abolition is the only answer, right? Like at some point you have to recognize that maybe it's not the students, maybe it's you, maybe it's the system that needs work. And so I think when we think about anti-racism, it's very important and it's necessary. And in education, anti-racism is working to dismantle the impact of systemic racism for students and teachers. And you need that. And you need teachers that know that Black and brown kids can succeed, and you need them to confront their bias, and you need representation. You need novels with protagonists of color, and you need examples of scientists and mathematicians, and we need all of that. But we also need to recognize that even if we do this overhaul kind of cosmetic makeover of what education looks like, there's still some structural problems about our system that is making it so that only 30 to 40% are succeeding, right? So I think for me, when I think about abolition, I'm not just talking about teacher training. I'm not just talking about cosmetic things and how students feel. And I'm not just talking about demographics. I'm talking about like the budget, talking about the schedule. Where is the school? Is the school in the neighborhood? What's the relationship between the school and the community? What are the hours that kids are expected to be at the school? Does the school allow students to thrive, right? Or is it socializing students from every community, be they Black, brown, or anything else, into white, middle-class values to participate in our, misogynistic capitalist system? So I think at a certain point, especially in education, abolition is the only way. I think anti-racism and specifically dismantling anti-Blackness in education will get us along the path, right? Will get us closer to where we need to be. But if you look at the roots of how the system was founded and who it's founded for, right? Our schools come out of Presbyterian grammar schools that were only meant for white upper class boys in the suburbs. Is it really practical to think that a system that was designed for that clientele is really going to work in 2050? Right? And look at most of universities. Who are these universities originally conceptualized and designed for? And how similar are they to their original design? Do you think that meets the needs of the students right now? Right? So we can talk about anti-racist practices at a university, but are you also unpacking your hiring practices, right? How are you paying your adjunct faculty? How many people of color do you have, not just on staff, but on tenure track and higher up decision-making processes? All of these kind of bigger systemic questions, I think once you ask yourself that and you find that the answers are overwhelmingly unsatisfactory, it will become apparent that abolition is not just like an option, but really the only option moving forward. But I don't want to discount the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, representation, because all of that will help to change the immediate conditions of people like you and I right now. Abolition, we're sowing seeds for a system that we probably won't see. So I think it needs to be a both and.
Thank you. And I love how you elaborated on sort of the significance of both inside-outside approaches to addressing systematic racism. That we definitely need folks on the streets yelling, screaming, making noise, And we also need folks who are doing the nitty-gritty work of navigating the existing systems, right? You know, that there's only so much we can do with yelling that you know, the institution needs to burn down, but at the same time, the institutions are what we currently have, right? And so, so with that said, go ahead, Mr. Hendricks.
So some people say that the system has failed Black people, people of color, other marginalized communities. I say that the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And once you realize that, you'll be aware that we have to tackle this system and uproot it completely, because it was designed not to work in our favor. Now, there'll be a few of us that are able to become doctors, become lawyers, become the president, right? But for the most part, the systems that are in place will continue to oppress marginalized communities. And I think a good example is what Deanna touched on, right? Being inclusive, equity, all these different buzzwords that are being used to, I guess you can say, make it seem as if these different institutions and corporations are doing their due diligence to address racism, but they're not. Just because you have, you know, a Black CEO or you have a Black principal at a school doesn't mean that those people are not perpetuating white supremacist rhetoric and practices in those particular institutions. And that's the for me, that's the difference between anti-racism and abolition. To me, anti-racism is saying, oh, we don't use words like the N-word, right? But like, sorry for laughing, I'm sorry. But which is fine, yeah, don't use the N-word. But we need more than that, right? That we need to address the systemic and structural racism and forces that are oppressing us, that are killing us, that are murdering us. If you look at the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, for me as a Black man, there is nothing that we can do with that system. If you look at the history of policing in America, right? It originates from slave catchers. The people that used to go out, they'll have their canines and their dogs, right? They'll go out and they would capture runaway slaves. The police still use dogs. The slave catchers, they had badges. They looked like stars, just like the LA County Sheriff's Department. The LA Sheriff's Department has a gang, right? People don't know about these things. These things cannot be fixed. And that's not and like Deanna mentioned, that's not a diss to those who are doing the work to reform the system, because they do in some cases help within the immediate future, right? But we need to have a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy to address the inequities in our communities. But shout out to Emanuel and Deanna. You both answered that question very well. Like, I don't have anything to add. y'all covered it.
Sure, thank you for that take, Mr. Hendricks. So I think we definitely see a clear distinction between, you know, what we call disarticulating existing systems from re-articulating them, right? So the word articulation, it has, you know, I think what most of us think of is, you know, when you talk and you speak, you're articulating. Articulating also means to put things together, right? So think of like, you know, for those of you who played Legos, when you put Lego pieces together, you're articulating them. And so the articulations of things like white supremacy, right, or Black inferiority, you know, there's only so many different ways that you can re-articulate that combination or those associations. right? Or white power. But, you know, the final solution, I think that many, further left-leaning scholars and activists have come to, is that it needs to be disarticulated, right? It needs to be abolished. And so we know that in the post-civil rights era, there's, like you said, Jelani, there's been purveying this myth of a post-racial society, that with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965, that, discrimination, became an irrelevant obstacle to upward mobility and to the advancement, economic, advancement of communities of color, particularly Black people. And people use Barack Obama, the success of Oprah, and the success of Black and brown faces in high places, right, as evidence of this. But when we're data driven in our sort of analysis of material conditions, we know that that's not true for the masses of people of color, of Black and brown people in this country, and certainly not around the world, right? And the ways that the United States not only exploits Black and brown bodies here, but exploits Black and brown African, Asiatic, and Central and Southern American resources, abroad, right? And so with that being said, I want to, before we dive into our Q&A, I want you all to sort of talk about the rise in anti-Asian hate incidents in this country in the wake of the pandemic, and the targeting of Asian Americans, and its relation, right, to anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, right? I think there's an expression that folks like to use when we talk about discrimination against people of color broadly. They say we're all in the same boat, right? They say we're all in the same boat. And then somebody said, we're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same storm, but we're actually in different boats, right? And everybody's boat has a different sort of response to the storm, but it's a sort of shared struggle nonetheless, right? How would you respond, right, to the notion that the Black community, right, is largely who is perpetrating the anti-Asian hatred, the anti-Asian sort of attacks?
I've seen the video. I saw like a video of this elderly Asian woman being attacked, and it was just crazy to me. And the way I see it is, I think like a lot of the hate that the way I see it is, you were talking about how does it connect to like anti-Blackness. What I see it is, reason why there's like any of these types of hate is because both of these like ethnic groups, they're not white. That's the fact. They're not white. So there's underlying hate from both of these ethnic groups. And I think with Black people, even what I've noticed is like there is like a tension between like Black people and African people. And what I've realized is it's the way that Black people and like just the way that America like portrays history and things like that. Black people are taught to like, oh, Africa is like this dirty backwater place, and then they're told to like hate their heritage. And then like even with Asian Americans, there's a lot of like Asian American hate. I remember I was watching a video, and it was, I can't remember the lady's name, but she's an Asian American TV reporter, and she was talking about how she used to be like, she used to work at like her local like news station, and she's talking about how she wanted to like get higher up in the ranks, and her boss was like, oh nope, you can't because she had like more Asian features. And like she kept trying, it was like, nope, you have more Asian features. They were just like hating on her because of these Asian features. And then she went on, she had surgery for, I think it was called double eyelid surgery to change it. And then she had like more doors opening and things like that. And how it's just like a whole bunch of underlying things. The way I was like looking at it is I was looking at like the news and how the coronavirus was like broadcasted. Like Donald Trump, he was even on TV talking about it's a China virus, this, that, and the third, it's an Asia virus. And I think because of like, especially like the Black experience, because our history is here in America and everything that they broadcast to us and they tell us is like what we know. Not too many people like know like the underlying things. They like they don't, not to say it as an excuse, because it's not, there's no excuse for any of the things that they're doing. There's no like excuse, no like if and or buts. But these are the reasons why, because America like portrays these like racist like images and stuff. Like even like I even noticed like there's this thing called like K-pop or something, and I saw a video. It was he's an Asian American man, like an Asian American YouTuber. So he was talking about how like in Korea they had like their artists getting double eyelid surgery and getting more like white looking features just so they can like sell to the West, just so they can be like more like what's the word I'm looking for? More I can't remember the word, but just like more like I can't remember the word, but it's just like these features that are less Asians, but they like are more like white and Eurocentro and stuff like that. And just like how like all these like underlying hate and stuff, like they get passed around. I even saw like a video was talking about how like they used to like have white actors playing Asian characters in movies and just like portraying these like stereotypes of like some dude right in the Chinese shop and like all these things that are in media, like even on the news and just everything, because it's like portrayed and it's just like blasted everywhere, it leads to these things in attacks. And I'm not saying that, like again, I'm not saying that it is an excuse. There is no excuse for any of these things that are happening, but these are the reasons, because it is portrayed and it is something that is just like widely accepted. Because I don't think anybody, because I heard some people call him out, but like nothing happened after he called it a China virus. Nobody like held him accountable or anything. But because of things like that, that's why things like that happen.
Yeah, and I love this question because I think it's especially important in California where Asian folks and Black and Brown, everybody shares so much space. And so you have a couple of things happening. For folks who, I hope you're familiar with the model minority myth. If you're not, like you can Google it, but in briefly, it's this idea that out of all minorities, problematic and antiquated term, but out of minorities, Asian folks, especially East Asian folks, are the model, right? They're the most compliant with white supremacy culture, right? They're the most palatable to whiteness. So you have a sense of hierarchy within people of color. And any person of color, whether or not they admit it, is aware that there is a hierarchy. In the same way that there's colorism in every country, that's why skin bleaching is $1 billion business, there's a hierarchy within people of color. So you have that happening. But I think it's also important to note that this is how white supremacy works. White supremacy doesn't actually even need white people. It can continue on. If there was no white people tomorrow, white supremacy would be alive and well because it's internalized. So Black people, Black Americans are internalizing xenophobic notions about Asian people, right? Because you go through the American school system. So a contemporary answer or example right now is Dr. Seuss, right? I don't know if y'all are following that. Dr. Seuss, big time racist, very anti-Asian, did cartoons promoting Japanese internment camps, beloved children's author and American hero, right? So we're exposed to a lot of xenophobic notions in our history and as Americans, right, in the school system. And then you also have the added complication that for a lot of Black and Brown people, there are cultural assumptions about other groups. So for me, growing up as a Black person, I was always told and under the assumption, based on my experience as a Black person, that Black people and Asian people don't get along. Was there a story told? No. I don't know what the beef was. That's just what I was enculturated into, right? And I think in places like Oakland and Los Angeles, where there's a lot of both Black and Asian people, there are histories of confrontation. And so I encourage folks to look that up if you haven't read about that. So you have that historical tension. But it's important to remember that it's all because of white supremacy. It's all because of this false notion of scarcity. It's this false idea that we have to compete. Black people and Asian people have to be adversaries because only one will win. Because white supremacy tells us that there's not enough room for all y'all to be BIPOCs, right? Like somebody's got to go down. So a lot of times, what is that? It's anti-Blackness. And that's why there's anti-Blackness in like every culture. That's why there's colorism, right? Because to be Black is like the bottom of the ladder. And then you also have the added complication that a lot of folks who are Asian and don't live in the United States are exposed to a very particular narrative about Black people. Like if you travel internationally, there's like only a few stories about Black people that you hear, and most of them aren't good. So you have that factor, right? That influence of like the world doesn't know really what to make of Black people. They only see what they see from gangster movies and Tyler Perry. Then you have Black people raised in pro-American, right, in Eurocentric and American-centric ideals in our education system. Then you have white supremacy basically encouraging us to duke it out. And so I think it's important like that we recognize this is how it operates by pitting us against each other. And the solution is keeping your eye on the prize, keeping your eye on like, okay, who's the real problem here? Like, are we going to argue about who can take up space in this community? Are we going to fight, Latinx people for supposedly gentrifying? Are we going to recognize like, hey, wait a minute, why can't we live on the West Side? Like, why can't we all go over there? Why are we stuck over here? Why are we arguing over scraps? And I think that the conversation has to start with, especially this generation, owning up to and accounting for the anti-Blackness and the anti-Asianness in our own communities. Like in the same way that I encourage white people, like if you want to be an ally, go get your other white people. You need to have conversations with them and help them unpack it so I don't have to unpack it with them. Black people need to do the same thing. We need to talk about anti-Asian sentiment in the Black community. And we need to talk about colorism, right, and anti-Blackness in the Asian community. And it's on us really to call out our aunties, uncles, grandma, like, ooh, let's not do that. Let's sit down. I want to talk to you about something, right? Break it down for folks because that's the only way that it's going to get better. And the sooner that happens, since we're not the minority, since there's more people of color with a vested interest in dismantling white supremacy than there are white supremacists, right? As soon as that happens, we can move forward. But this is a perfect example. And what if this moment isn't a turning point, what's going to happen is this is going to be used to further separate us. Like, look, see, Black people beating up Asian people. This is why Black people are bad, right? You're going to internalize that message. And it's going to be another generation of antagonism between those two very powerful communities that if they got together could really make some change. So it's really on us to unpack that with our own people right now.
My goodness. So while I digest that, Mr. Hendricks, go ahead and share your take on intercommunal violence and intercommunal solidarity. How do we go from one to the other?
Yeah, man, I will say history repeats itself. And I say that because when I watched Trump basically blame Chinese people, Asian people for the COVID-19 virus, it kind of reminded me of Hitler and how he would villainize the Jews during the Holocaust. History repeats itself. And it's unfortunate that people are targeting Asian people for something that they didn't do. And I hope that we can learn from the last year and move forward. As far as tension between Black people, Asian people, that's been going on for a while. I can talk about the history of South Central Los Angeles a little bit, but a lot of immigrant Asian people would come to America, come to Los Angeles, and would start businesses in Black neighborhoods. And that's crazy because Black people didn't have access to the resources, right, to start businesses in their own neighborhood. But people from another country came in, set up shop, and a lot of times the businesses that they set up were donut shops, liquor stores, unfavorable institutions or businesses, and a lot of crime and a lot of bad things happened in or around these businesses. So it definitely created tension between Black and Asian people, because you have two groups of people that are being pitted against each other, and the establishment will allow another marginalized group of people to come in to further oppress another group of people. What do I mean by that? So if you have liquor stores in the community, it facilitates alcoholism in that particular community, right? So the tension is set up by white supremacy, but the tension is there for a reason, and it needs to be addressed first and foremost, right? Because at the end of the day, it divides us, and we can do way more together than separated. And like Deanna mentioned, we need to address anti-Black racism in the Asian community, but we also have to address xenophobia in the Black community. And we need to do it sooner than later. I will also add, just me, like just personally, I have encountered anti-Black racism or prejudice from the Asian community. But for me, I understand what's going on. I see it from a bigger picture, and I don't project those feelings that I had in those particular situations on the entire ethnic group or on an entire group of people. That's crazy. But nonetheless, I think that it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. And we need to show solidarity. But I think sometimes in the Black community, we say to ourselves, and I heard this from Black people, right? Oh, now they know how it feels to be Black. And it, like, why would we want someone to go through what we're going through, right? Like, that's not cool. You know, it kind of reminds me of older folks who've paid off their student loans, and they're like, oh, I had to pay my loans, you do too, right? It's kind of like the same thing. And you mentioned the model minority narrative. So, you know, it's just like, oh, they'll be okay. You know, it kind of gets brushed over. Oh, you know, they have high, you know, they're in all the top schools, you know, oh, they have money, all this, all that. But a lot of Southeast Asian people in this country are living in poverty, are dealing with racism, are dealing with mass incarceration, but you don't hear about it because it's not on TV, you know. So there's groups like Khmer Girls in Action, right, in Long Beach. They do work with Khmer people in Long Beach because there's certain things that need to be addressed. There's certain things that they're going through that the broader society doesn't acknowledge.
That's real. And that really reminds me of the term that a theorist by the name of Antonio Gramsci popularized called a false consciousness, right? And a lot of times when we're faced with, when we're dealing with oppressive circumstances as a group within our like ethnocentric purview, we tend to blame the person in closest proximity to us for our suffering, right? And when communities are in competition for scarce resources, it's very alluring to do that, right? To blame so-and-so, to blame this group, and to project, you know, that animosity onto that particular group, right? And so we'll go ahead and close it out with this question. Each of you, again, are very, you know, adamant about anti-racism, about abolition work in your respective areas. You know, Ms. Smith, you and as a school administrator, and as a, you know, as someone vested in educational equity, you know, Mr. Caronli as a high school student, right, and as a student organizer, and Mr. Hendricks in the area of labor organizing, right? So, so what does your day-to-day, tell us about your day-to-day. How do you foster anti-racism, abolition and solidarity, intercommunal solidarity in your day-to-day work? And what are some resources that you can offer to our viewers that can help them get a better grasp of of how to be a more effective anti-racist, or how to be a more effective abolitionist?
So in my new position, my current position, I serve as the special assistant to our president, April Verrett. I work at SEIU 2015. It's the largest labor union in California, and it's led by a Black woman, founded by a Black woman. And what's unique about this particular labor union is they look at, or we look at, our members as whole people, not just workers, right? And we represent home care workers, we represent nursing home workers, and this is very hard work. And it's not valued. They're paid poverty wages. And we do our best to make sure that they get more money, they have more benefits, but we also recognize that they live in particular communities that lack resources, right? Their family, they're being impacted by displacement, gentrification, police brutality, mass incarceration, racism, sexism, right? Because over 90% of our members are women. So it's our due diligence to make sure we address those other issues as well, and not just their issues as as workers. So I have a unique position where I can use my background and my skills to inform the leadership of our union on how to be an anti-racist organization. And they actually came out and said, hey, we're an anti-racist organization, which may not be a big deal to a lot of you. But for a labor union to do that, it's huge. It is huge. It's historic, because historically, labor unions have been ran by white men. And you have this, emerging, one of the biggest unions in the nation, calling out anti-racism and challenging it, calling out anti-Black racism and challenging it. And now we're in a position to influence other labor unions to do the same thing. And some have got on board, others are a little bit slow to the party, and some of them may not come. But if we make that the norm, we'll be able to really shift labor's positionality when it comes to racism, sexism, and every other ism. So I'm excited about that. We also have the opportunity at this moment to address anti-Black racism in particular, because it's actually being centered for the first time. I've been doing this work for years, and it's always a people of color narrative. Now it's like, no, we need to address anti-Black racism because, like you said, Gabriel, we're not all in the same boat. Matter of fact, my people came here in a boat, right? We actually built this country. We were enslaved. We were looked at as chattel. So it's different. We all suffer from racism, but it's a different type of racism we experience. And the Weingart Foundation, they do philanthropy. They asked my boss to chair what we call the Black Action Team, which is a group of Black leaders in academia, philanthropy, labor, education, the nonprofit sector, to really put together a report along with a set of policy recommendations to change the material conditions and outcomes of Black Angelenos, and not just the city of Los Angeles, but the entire county. And the reason why we have the privilege to do this work in the first place is because people like my boss, April Verrett, and other Black leaders said, hey, Black people are being disproportionately impacted in virtually every issue area there is, whether it's education, homelessness, gentrification. So for instance, here in Los Angeles County, Black people make up about 9% of the population. but we make up damn near 40% of the homeless population. It's crazy, right? 1 in 22 Black men in LA are homeless, right? If you compare those numbers to white people, Asian people, any other ethnic group, it's not even close. It's not. So
my bad, Jelani. We're at time. So I'm not even sure.
Sorry about that.
If you're good. Thank you though. So Ms. Smith and Manny, real quick, if you can just respond to the question.
Yeah, so in 1 minute, what I do as to like elevate this work on a daily basis is just make sure that in every decision-making process, questions about like who benefits from this policy and who loses, how does this disproportionately impact Black and Brown students, all of that is my priority. So I think that when you're thinking about this work, yes, think about policies that you want to enact and break down, but also think about like day-to-day decisions and conversations that you have an opportunity to disrupt. And as far as resources, I have a lot, and I feel bad because I think there were some education-specific questions on there. So just a quick plug, if you want me to answer something about education in particular, you can follow me on Instagram. My name is @Deanna Smith, and I do a lot of work for folks in education there. So if you have an education question, sorry I didn't get to it, you can ask me. You can just send me a DM.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Mr. Caronli, real quick.
The way I uplift this work is just like, because I'm in quarantine, I'm still like just a teenager. I just like try to like share it on social media, and I try to educate myself as much as I can, especially because like I'm in quarantine, I have all this time in the world. I've been trying to watch as many videos and just learn new things. And whenever like things like this or like conversations like this come or arise, I'll try and put my voice in it and try and learn something new from it. That's how I elevate the work.
That's real. So shout out to each and every single one of you. Thank you, Ms. Smith, Mr. Hendricks, Mr. Caronli for pulling up. Y'all are doing dope work, very unique work, cutting edge work, right? And I just really want to emphasize and uplift that the things that you all are getting into. I mean, Mr. Caronli, I wish I was in a position to be doing some of the stuff that you're doing, as a high school student. I was incarcerated when I was your age. And Mr. Hendricks, you're a real one. I mean, keep doing what you're doing. You look real sharp in the shirt and blazer. And Miss Smith, man, you really dropped some real bombs on, metaphorical bombs, right? On us and gems of knowledge. So, and thank you to all the viewers. My apologies for going slightly over time, and hopefully this was helpful, for the
You're
UCLA.
good. Thank you, Gabriel.
Go ahead. Let me go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can finish. Go ahead.
Close out. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to and thank you, Kendra, and your team for inviting us out. Definitely enjoyed it. And let's do this again.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for bringing in these panelists, for sharing your narratives with us, and providing many, many resources to continue our path of becoming anti-racist. Thank you to the UCLA Alumni Association for helping us in the creation of this event. Finally, thank you for attending the second part of our series. We hope you can take something away from the panel, and be sure to sign up for our final installment of the World Through the Lens of Race series, happening on May 21st, facilitated by UCLA Alumni Association President, Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza. Once again, thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.